Thank you so much, Amy. Welcome, everybody. This is Laura Egan, the Senior Director of Programs at Clery Center, and we are so excited to launch our National Campus Safety Awareness Month 2018 campaign with today's first webinar, What's Your Message? Answering FAQs on Clery Compliance. I'm joined today by my colleague, Abigail Boyer, and I would love to give her a chance to just introduce herself before we get going on some content. Abby, would you be able to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for the first webinar for National Campus Safety Awareness Month. Each year, we always do free resources and educational opportunities in relation to NACSAM, so it quickly becomes our favorite part of the year, and we really appreciate you taking time out of your schedules to join us. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Laura.
Thanks so much, Abby. And so, before we begin any webinar, we always like to kind of recenter ourselves on what Clery Center is and who Jean Clery was. And so Clery Center is a national nonprofit training organization that aims to work with colleges and universities to help them understand what the Clery Act requires and how to apply those pieces to their own unique campus cultures. We have really been committed to understanding and working with the concept of both the letter and spirit of the law, meaning what the law requires in writing, in the regulations, and then how that can be achieved and actualized to maybe a higher level, or maybe doing things that you're not necessarily required to do, but make a lot of sense and would really help to enhance the message of campus safety at your own institution. And so National Campus Safety Awareness Month is a perfect example of that in action. It's us hoping to model for you what living both the spirit and letter of the law looks like. For those of you that do not know, we were founded by the parents of Jean Clery, Connie and Howard Clery. Jean was a student at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania when, in the spring of her first year there, she was raped and murdered in her dorm room. And her parents were obviously devastated by that loss and learned that there had been some crime occurring in and around the campus at that time, and wanted to understand more about how that information could have been shared with other parents like themselves, just so that folks would have a better understanding of what campus culture looks like. There were no requirements at the time that Jean died for campuses to do this, and so Connie and Howard worked at the local and state level in Pennsylvania to develop legislation that turned into the federal law that is Clery Act. And they also founded our organization, originally named Security on Campus and now known as Clery Center. And so we always just like to remember, as I'm sure many of you are working directly with students or other individuals, that this all started because of a person and because of a family's care for a person and the loss of that person. And so whatever draws you to working in higher education or working in violence prevention or campus safety, Clery Center always likes to say thank you for that work that you do, and thank you for making the time in your day to come and spend some extra minutes with us to learn maybe how you can do that work in a different way or in a better way. For us at Clery Center, a lot of our role is performing what we call training and technical assistance on the Clery Act. And so that involves answering a lot of questions that campuses have all the time about what the Clery Act is and what it requires. And sometimes what we find are that the folks that are responsible for Clery compliance on a campus can feel a little bit isolated, or like they're the only person that fully understands all pieces. And so we wanted to try to support any work this year that could help either Clery folks or campuses in general reframe their messaging on campus safety overall and then the Clery Act in particular. So our theme this entire month is What's Your Message? So examining how you talk about campus safety and how you talk about the services that you provide and what messages you might be sending intentionally or inadvertently with all of the work that you do. And so we hope that through the resources we're providing this month as well as these webinars, we're giving you the opportunity to focus on possibly revising or refreshing those messages, or even working across campus with other partners to streamline those messages so that you can not only better understand your own work and help others understand that work, but work towards the ultimate goal for us, which is institutionalization of Clery compliance. So the more folks that understand the nature of the work, both on a Clery level and on a campus safety level in general, the more people that can be ambassadors for that work and for that message. And so then it works to help have either, however you want to approach it, a top-down or bottom-up approach to creating Clery compliance as something that an institution cares about and is responsible for, and is not isolated to the work of one individual or one office or department on a campus. So we have a whole website dedicated to National Campus Safety Awareness Month. You'll see the website right there, naxam.clerycenter.org, and that houses resources from the past couple of years as well as this year, and provides some links to other messaging and other resources that you could use on your campus. Links to some actual resources that we've launched this year, as well as ones from past years. It's also a place where we will store the information on how to register for all of our additional webinars coming up this month. So please visit that website for some of those resources if you're looking to bolster your work any further this month or any other month. In general, some key resources that we'll reference throughout the month, or really always when we're talking about the Clery Act in particular, is the statute and regulations itself. So that's the law, what the law says, and then the regulations are the guidance on how to implement that law. We'll talk about a book called the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting a lot. This is a document that is published by the Department of Education, and it is technically sub-regulatory guidance in that it is not the law itself. But as it states within the document itself, this is the most helpful guide for campuses to use when applying Clery Act requirements, as the Department of Education says that it is a resource it uses when it conducts program reviews at campuses to determine if a campus is fully in compliance with the Clery Act. This resource is linked in the web links pod that you'll see on your screen, and it is available for free for anybody to download. If you just Google this name, it will come up right away for you. The most recent edition of the handbook was published in June of 2016, and that edition replaces all previous versions. So when we are referencing any information from the handbook, it is pulled from that 2016 edition. WESTAT is a federal contractor that provides technical assistance on the Clery Act on behalf of the Department of Education. And so sometimes if you're looking for a very specific answer, or if an institution wants a more official or formal response than what Clery Center can provide, we advise that you reach out to WESTAT. And so we provided their email address and phone number here. As the Department of Education is the enforcement authority for the Clery Act, WESTAT is the most close resource to the Department of Education itself to get an answer on Clery Act compliance questions. Clery Center is not the enforcement authority of the Clery Act, so we can provide guidance as to how to use the handbook and other resources to interpret the regulations, but we are not in the best position to give that official or formal answer. And WESTAT is in the next best position to do that, as they do work on behalf of the Department of Education. Lastly, so ED here is an abbreviation for the Department of Education, and so they do conduct program reviews on Clery compliance all the time, and the results of those reviews are available for public consumption through the Federal Student Aid Department's website, which is the department in which Clery compliance is housed. Clery is written as a federal consumer protection law, and so it is enforced by the Clery compliance team, which is a team within the Office of Federal Student Aid within the Department of Education. So on that website are the results of program reviews that the Department of Education has conducted, and we use those reviews often to guide our teachings and our content, as it is a free resource identifying common gaps and challenges that campuses encounter when trying to comply with the Clery Act. So we will possibly reference some of those throughout our webinar today, or even throughout webinars throughout the month. So we thought it would be helpful to highlight that for you as well today. So today's webinar is really designed to be an opportunity for all of you to either attend with maybe a Clery compliance team that you have on campus, or to bring the information that you gained from this webinar back to that team, because we find that you might have a team that touches on all different aspects of Clery compliance, but there are some parts of the Clery Act that are just really hard to comprehend and understand. And so at a minimum, that team, if that team can get on board with all the intricacies of Clery, or even just gain a more full understanding of certain aspects of Clery, It will improve the function of that team and will help start to build that group of ambassadors for the Clery Act on your campus. And so today we thought would be a great opportunity to either provide that resource for you all to take back to your team, or even to have this be a professional development session for your Clery compliance team in and of itself. If you're not attending with a team today, that is also perfectly okay. Content-wise, we're just going to be providing a brief overview of some basic areas of Clery, like CSAs and Clery Geography and Clery crimes, and then answer some frequently asked questions posed by you all that have been submitted ahead of time to us. So in addition to using this as a PD for your own Clery compliance folks, it definitely can be a helpful individual exercise to brush up on some details of Clery as well. So you'll see that today we'll refresh some pieces there, some foundational teachings and elements of Clery Act items like campus security authorities or CSAs, Clery Geography, and Clery crimes. And then we'll reference some resources and language that you can use when explaining some of these concepts to your other campus partners. And then we'll be answering some frequently asked questions that have been sent in ahead of time, but we'll also give you the opportunity to ask questions through the training as well, or through the webinar as well. So if you do have a question as we are speaking, please don't hesitate to send it in through the group discussion pod, and then either myself or Abby will answer it when we see a good time to fit it in. And then in addition to asking questions, we will be providing some opportunities for you to interact with us today by answering either a poll or a chat box question or two. The polls and the chat box questions will come up within that group discussion pod, so it'll be pretty obvious when you have a chance to answer or share some information with us. And then we're going to be highlighting a resource that we developed for National Campus Safety Awareness Month this year that we are calling Clery Act Essentials. So trust us when we say we understand how challenging it is to sometimes summarize the Clery Act. We are always faced with this task at least once a day, either in answering a question from somebody on a campus or a reporter or a parent or a student. And so we thought at minimum it would be helpful to create a guide that is a handout that folks can reference that touches on major parts of Clery and provides some essential information that could then be passed on to other campus partners that might not be using technical language all the time but could understand concepts in a general way. So we hope that you find that resource beneficial. That resource is in the Files pod on your screen, so feel free to glance at it. Even now, it's okay. You're not spoiling anything, but we will touch on it specifically throughout the webinar today. And just as a brief refresher, so as with any training or webinar we conduct, this is not intended to be a soup to nuts training on the Clery Act, but we understand that it is helpful for everybody to kind of come in with the same baseline knowledge. So for those of you that might be newer to Clery, this might seem like a very quick overview, and those of you that have been doing Clery for a while, this might seem overly simplified. So we hope we meet you somewhere in the middle here by giving a brief refresher on what we're even talking about when we say the Clery Act. So just to reiterate one more time, the Clery Act is a federal consumer protection law that is enforced by the Department of Education's Clery compliance team, which is housed within the Federal Student Aid Office within the Department of Education. And so this law identifies a reporting authority for sharing information about crime on campus, and that reporting authority is called a campus security authority, and we will be going through how you would define a campus security authority today with you all. We also get information on reports of crimes, Clery crimes in particular, through requests from local law enforcement agencies that might have a patrol jurisdiction that covers your campus as well, or that just have information on crimes that were reported to them that occurred in your campus's Clery Geography. We will do an overview of what Clery Geography is during today's webinar, but that is a grouping of specific parts of your campus's buildings or property that relate to your campus in that they are owned or controlled by your institution and support the educational mission of the institution. What the Clery Act requires essentially is transparency and accountability about campus crime and then prevention and response efforts to those types of crimes. So on an annual basis, campuses are required to publish a document called the Annual Security Report, which contains Clery Act statistics, which are reports of Clery crimes that were reported to a campus security authority that occurred within Clery Geography. And then additionally to those statistics, Your annual security report, or ASR, contains policy statements, which are summaries or Cliff Notes versions of existing policies and procedures at your campus on certain aspects of campus safety. And then additionally, in an annual capacity, institutions must report their Clery statistics to the Department of Education each year through filling out an online survey that is administered by the Department of Education. And then in an ongoing capacity, institutions are required to make analyses on reported crimes to determine if they warrant the issuance of a timely warning, which is a type of alert used in certain circumstances. We won't go into the complete details of that today, but timely warnings are only issued for Clery crimes that occur within Clery Geography that pose a serious or ongoing threat to the institution. Additionally, campuses are required to determine if an emergency notification is warranted when there is an immediate emergency that is happening on a campus. Institutions with campus safety or security departments are required to maintain a daily crime log, which represents reports of crimes that occur within the institution's patrol jurisdiction. These crimes that are maintained in the daily crime log do not have to be Clery crimes, and they do not have to occur within Clery Geography in order to be included in the daily crime log. They just have to occur within the institution's patrol jurisdiction. And then lastly, in an ongoing capacity, institutions are required for maintaining certain rights and options for the survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. And that is one of the most recent additions to the Clery Act as a result of the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act back in 2013. So we will not spend so much time talking about the intricacies of that piece today, but it is something to keep in mind, especially as you're analyzing what Clery compliance looks like as a whole. So before we get started with today's content, we really would love to learn a little bit more about who has attended today's webinar. So we're going to launch our first poll. And so if you could just respond with how your functional role on your campus fits into one of these categories, or if it doesn't, please select other. That would be great. So you're letting us know if your functional role falls into the category of campus police or security, student affairs, athletics, emergency management, if you are a Clery coordinator, if you are a Title IX coordinator, or if you are something that is not any of those other pieces. So if you would please take a few moments to just complete that poll so we have a better idea of who has joined us today. And I'll give you all a few seconds to complete that poll. And great, as results are coming in, it looks like we have a high amount of folks that are in campus police or campus security. We do have a lot of folks that are in the other category, it looks like. So if you are identifying in that other category, if you would plug into the group discussion pod the role that you do have at your campus, just so that we gain some understanding as to who is attending today. That would be super helpful. And of course, we're always excited to see when there are Clery coordinators on here. So I'm so glad that there are so many Clery coordinators. That is really great to see also. So I see a lot of folks on here that are identifying as being part of financial aid or risk management. Many of you that are project coordinators for the Office on Violence Against Women's Campus Grant Program, which Clery Center is a TA provider for, which is awesome. Thank you so much. And then we also see folks identifying perhaps in overall compliance or occupational health and safety roles, which makes sense also. So great. Thank you so much for taking the time to complete the poll and to share the role that you play on your campus. It's really helpful for us to see. So I'll ask Amy if you wouldn't mind to just close that poll now. Thank you so much. Perfect. And then I'm just going to ask one more piece for all of you. If you could take a minute to just share in the group discussion pod your answer to these questions. So first, do you know if you are a CSA, yes or no? And if you are a CSA, have you previously received any training at your institution as a CSA? Take a few moments to answer those two questions. Do you know if you're a CSA or not? And if so, have you received any training at your institution? So wonderful. I see a lot of folks are saying yes and yes to both questions. Some folks are saying they do not know and they don't therefore think they have been trained, which would make sense. I do see people, too, saying that they are CSAs, but they've received training elsewhere, so maybe not on their campus. And some people are just, saying they're not quite sure. So that is totally great. We, anticipated all of those types of answers, but that helps us guide the way we'll frame our next section, which is an overview of what campus security authorities are in general, and that is going to be handled by my colleague, Abby. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Abby, to start walking folks through what CSAs are.
Thank you so much, and I think Laura already started giving a really good introduction, because the phrase campus security authorities can be somewhat misleading if we were thinking about it outside of a Clery lens, because normally if you see the term campus security authority, you might assume that that's campus police or campus security. And for those of you who are sitting here trying to figure out, well, am I a campus security authority? I'm not quite sure. I don't remember getting any specific training. It's really helpful to have a good sense of what those definitions are and how institutions determine who their campus security authorities are. So campus security authorities are very specific roles under Clery in that the phrase is intended to capture anyone that meets any one of these 4 definitions that you see on the screen here. Now, some roles can actually meet more than one of these definitions, but when the Clery Act is saying that the institution needs to identify who their campus security authorities are, it means that the institution needs to have a process to identify what roles at the institution meet any one of these 4 areas. So the first one tends to be a little bit more obvious, campus police or security. So the question that you ask is, do we have a campus police or public safety department? That could be sworn, that could be non-sworn. Anyone who falls within the role of campus police and security is considered to be a campus security authority. Most people would understand that connection, but as we move on to some of these other roles, that's where some institutions tend to have more questions, as we're going to see as we get to the Q&A section of this particular webinar. It also includes individuals responsible for security. Now, certainly campus police and security would be responsible for security, but as you think about your own campus, you might think of other roles that provide a security function but may not necessarily have a security title. For example, many of your residence halls might have access monitors, might have other individuals who perform some sort of function related to security and access into the building. RAs themselves could be considered as individuals responsible for security, although they certainly fall into another CSA definition as well. But when we think about these individuals that are tasked in some way for the safety and security of our campus, that may be in a department that is labeled police or security, or that could be other roles where their function is related to security. And we're going to get back to function in just a moment. It also includes individuals or offices designated to receive crime reports. And your institution makes the decision as to who those individuals are. This is an area where some campuses will actually broaden the scope a bit as to who's considered to be a CSA, because they craft specific roles as individuals or offices designated to receive crime reports. So think about any of your policies related to crime reporting. That could be things like your dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking policy. That could be other policies that really outline who in your campus community can receive a report, who you would like reports to go to. So anyone designated in your policies that where you are directing a member of your community to report a crime in some capacity would be considered a campus security authority. But then this last definition is probably the broadest. It may be where a lot of your roles, for those of you who are saying that you're CSAs, it may be where you fall into the CSA definition, which is officials with significant responsibility for student and campus activities. So when I mentioned that RAs tend to fall in more than one category, this is an example of where RAs might also fit in, because they're an official, they are tasked with responding on behalf of the institution, and they have significant responsibility for student and campus activities. Other roles that fall into this category are things like coaches or an advisor to Greek life. It could be the Title IX coordinator is certainly a campus security authority. This is also where the most recent Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting named a number of different roles, such as advocates are now considered to be CSAs, other individuals that might be a part of a sexual assault response team on campus. And when we think about where and how they fit into these definitions, many times it's because they're designated to receive a crime report, or as some part of their role or function, they have significant responsibility for student and campus activities. So when I said earlier that institutions identify who their CSAs are, you'll notice I use that language as opposed to something like designate, because sometimes that implies that the campus decides who their CSA is or who their CSAs are. And what can't happen is for an institution to say, well, we've decided that these 5 people are campus security authorities. What every campus has to do is to assess various roles on campus to determine if their function makes them a CSA. So for those of you who said, yes, I'm a campus security authority, or no, I'm not a campus security authority, I want you to think right now about where you fit into any one of these 4 definitions. So if someone said to you, why are you a campus security authority, you'd be able to communicate, well, I'm an official with significant responsibility for student and campus activities. I'm tasked with responding on behalf of the institution if someone comes to report to me. Or I'm an individual responsible for security in this capacity. That's really the question and answer that institutions do when analyzing who their CSAs are. And then from there, we always encourage them to think about, the theme of NACSAM this year is what's your messaging? So to think about how are we communicating about this role to our campus security authorities, both what is the expectation, so what are we asking you to do as CSAs, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, and also why are we asking you to do that? So for a lot of institutions and for a lot of people, that's beyond just, well, the federal law is saying you're required to report, although that may certainly be true. But if you're thinking about it through the lens of messaging, it's also considering, well, how do we show them the importance of reporting the CSAs? What is the purpose and function of this act as a whole, and why is their role so important? And we'll talk about that more as we explore CSAs throughout the remainder of the webinar. It's important to note that certain roles are exempt from reporting, so pastoral and professional counselors are not considered to be CSAs. They are exempt. So the law does carve out some roles that are truly confidential, and pastoral and professional counselors are those roles. And then the CSA's primary responsibility. So if you asked any CSA, what are you supposed to do under this role of CSA, they should be able to communicate that I report to X office, whatever office that is for your institution, any crimes that are reported to me within the list of Clery Act crimes, which we're going to review in just a moment. So we're not asking them to investigate. We're not asking them to determine whether or not the crime took place. As long as a CSA learns from an individual who comes to them and discloses or shares that they were the victim of a crime, or perhaps someone else in the campus community was a victim of a crime, say you have someone who's coming on behalf of a friend, that campus security authority is expected to report that via the structure at your own institution. And that structure can vary from campus to campus. So we have a number of Clery coordinators that are on this webinar. So from those institutions, those individuals might be reporting directly to the Clery coordinator. That role may sit in a number of different departments. It could be in campus police. It could be in student affairs. It could be elsewhere. You could have an institution that doesn't have a Clery coordinator but has another collection agency or body or individual of this information. So CSAs need to know what is expected of me and where does this information need to go. And we'll talk about that a bit further as we progress in the webinar. But for now, since we want to make sure everyone's on the same page with some of the base concepts before we answer your frequently asked questions, I'm going to hand it back over to Laura so that she can give a quick overview of Clery Geography.
Great. Thank you so much, Abby. So we know that Clery Geography can sometimes be really confusing for folks that are especially not working in and around Clery all the time. So we try to provide language through resources like Clery Act Essentials or even a webinar like this that would translate to multiple people, just no matter what your role is or how you intersect with Clery. So Clery Geography refers to buildings or property that fall into one of 4 categories defined under the Clery Act. And the Clery Act defined geography in these certain ways so that when you are attributing statistics for crimes, it is clear for people that consume that information where the crime took place. So some of these categories are more straightforward than others, and so we will spend a little bit of time just walking through each of them and some considerations to take into account when you're thinking through what they represent. But in general, there is on-campus property. Then there is on-campus student housing, which is a subset of on-campus property. There is public property, which is thought of in relation to on-campus property. And then non-campus buildings or property. So your on-campus property is what we like to call your core campus. It is buildings or property that are owned or controlled by your institution that are serving the educational mission of the institution and frequently used by students. So those buildings and property that are making up what your campus considers or what your constituents consider to be your core campus would really be that on-campus property. So where your academic buildings are, your residence halls are, things like your cafeteria or dining hall, all of those things make up your core campus or on-campus property. Institution-associated buildings or property, so perhaps if your institution has a foundation or something like that that is physically located close to your core campus, those would also be considered a part of your institution's on-campus property. So language reasonably contiguous is used in relation to on-campus property because you are thinking of things as in relation to how close they are to your core campus. And so the language of reasonably contiguous has always been part of the definition of on-campus property, but until recently was not really defined. And so as of the 2016 handbook, the language of reasonably contiguous has been defined to mean anything within 1 mile of the borders of your core campus that your institution owns or controls. And so when I say anything, I mean buildings or property. So buildings or property that your institution owns or controls that is within 1 mile of the borders of your core campus could be considered to be part of your on-campus property. So this is not a rule as much as it is a guideline because an institution's makeup as a campus could definitely influence how this rule is applied. So if you are an urban campus versus a more rural campus, anything your institution owns or controls within 1 mile of your campus could be either a lot of different properties or it could be very little, depending on your situation. So this language is in the handbook as a guideline to use if you're struggling to determine whether or not a building or property that you own or control that is used for educational purposes and is frequently used by students is reasonably contiguous to your core campus or not. If it's not reasonably contiguous, it would fall into another Clery Geography category that we'll go through in a moment. But if it is, then you would most likely count it in that on-campus property category. So the language of directly support or relate to educational purposes is part of the language of the definition of on-campus property, and so that's why we're just highlighting it there. We say that because it is not enough to just say any property or buildings that your institution owns or controls would be considered part of your on-campus property, because as you all know, institutions might own or control various properties or buildings that are used for different purposes. Some campuses might actually lease a building out to another organization or entity for them to use it primarily. So the law is trying to make distinguishing factors here between buildings or property used for other reasons and buildings or property owned or controlled by the institution that directly support or relate to the educational purposes of the institution. And we have separate campuses on here because they are another consideration for on-campus properties. Institutions might have one or more functioning campuses. An example of a type of separate campus might be a school or a branch campus. So some institutions might have a law school or medical school that is more than a mile away from its core campus. Or you might have multiple branches of your institution located at various locations across your state. All of those are examples of a separate campus. And we won't go into too much more about separate campuses today, but we do highlight that here as it is another example of a type of on-campus property. It's not its own category per se, but separate campuses are a way to think about on-campus property. Public property is any public property that is within or immediately adjacent to your on-campus property. So as you can see with this third bullet here, you don't have to worry about public property as it pertains to your non-campus locations, which we're going to define in a moment. So public parking is really, public property, not public parking. Public property is analyzed as it relates to on-campus property. You might hear people talk about this sidewalk, street, sidewalk, quote unquote, rule, and that is just an example or a way to think about the limits to which you would count public property immediately surrounding your core campus. So you would count the public sidewalk that immediately abuts your core campus, then the street, and then the sidewalk across the street as the limits of public property immediately adjacent to your core campus or to your on-campus property. So it's just a rule that is used when making those determinations about the extent of your public property. Some things come into account, or some special considerations come up when your campus immediately abuts a public parking lot or a public park or a public waterway, and there are specific rules to take into account for how far you count into those types of locations in terms of distance, or how you account for when your campus does abut those things. Those pieces are gone into more detail in the handbook in the section on geography in Chapter 2 that talks about public property. And so I don't want to go so far into detail today with those pieces, but I want to acknowledge that it's something that is taken into consideration as an area that you would need to further analyze to determine how and what you include in your public property category. And then lastly, there's non-campus property, which, similar to the final category of CSAs, is probably the most challenging category for folks to understand. What I would like to start with is what non-campus property is not. And so non-campus property is not simply off-campus properties. It is not private properties or locations. It was a term that was developed by the Clery Act to indicate buildings or properties that are owned or controlled by the institution, and then, as you'll see on the slide here, meet the criteria for on-campus property. So they're used in direct support of or in relation to the institution's educational purposes, and they are frequently used by students. However, they are not within the same reasonably contiguous geographic area of the institution. So now you can see why that defining of the term reasonably contiguous was so crucial with the 2016 handbook, because it literally is needed to understand what would be considered non-campus property or not. So basically, any buildings or property that your institution owns or controls that are not within a mile of the campus, of on-campus property, would most likely be considered non-campus property for the institution. So an example of this might be a classroom space that is 5 miles away that is rented out for a class Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 5 to 9 p.m. That would be an example of a non-campus property. Non-campus properties can be expansive or can be very limited, and then depending on how they grow or if there is an administrative presence there or not, a non-campus property could even be considered a separate campus. But that depends on, again, the level of organization to the program of study that is happening there and whether or not there is any administrative presence. Another piece to consider for non-campus property is any buildings or property that are owned or controlled by a student organization that is officially recognized by the institution would be considered part of the institution's non-campus property. The most common example of this would be when Greek organizations, as an organization, own a building or property. And so when they do that, and that Greek organization is an officially recognized organization of the institution, then that would be considered a non-campus property for the institution. This is not the same as a group of students that all happen to be members of the same organization that rent an off-campus house together. So for example, the soccer house or the lacrosse house, unless the soccer team or the lacrosse team as an organization itself owns or controls that building or property, that location would not be considered non-campus property. So again, it needs to be a location that is owned or controlled by the organization as an organization, and then that organization needs to be one that is officially recognized by the institution. And if those two factors are in play, then that location would be another example of non-campus property. There is a lot of nuance and detail to this particular geographic category, as you can see. And so we do bring this up a little bit in the Clery Act Essentials document, but we also highlight it in another document that we created a couple of NACSAMs ago called Understanding Statistics under the Clery Act. And that document is available through our main website, and also we can highlight it or link it into this webinar today for you as well. But it further breaks down how you can understand Clery geographic categories and how they are connected to Clery crime statistics, which is something we're going to get into in a moment as well. So briefly, if I could ask you all to answer this chat box question, in addition to any questions that might be coming through. So we'll take a second to answer those as well. But what campus partners do you communicate with, if any, when classifying Clery geography? So this question is directed more towards those that are responsible for classifying Clery geography or that assist others at your campus with doing so. So what campus partners do you communicate with when you're classifying Clery geography? And while you all take a second to respond to that question, we did have a couple of questions come in, and I can take a second to answer or address those. The first one here is, for renting classroom space away from campus, is the property considered 24/7 non-campus property or just during the times that you are renting or leasing it? So I appreciate the folks that are helping to answer those questions, because that's exactly what I would say. The response of yes and no is what comes into play there. So for non-campus property, if you own the non-campus property, then you are responsible for reporting any crimes that are reported to have occurred there at any time. But if you are only renting or leasing it, so controlling it for certain periods of time, you don't own it, then you're only responsible for reporting crimes that occur there during the times that you control it or are using it. And then when we say reporting crimes that occur there, it's at the location that you're renting or leasing, and then any spaces used to access that room or location. So a stairwell, a lobby, an elevator. I hope that helps to answer that question. I did see another question coming over here too. For urban campuses, a building that's located mid-block, would a train station at the end of the block be considered public property for counting purposes? So this is a great example of a question that we typically get a lot, and it is a very specific one. So without any map or any visual to kind of support this, it's kind of a difficult one to answer, but I can answer at least in general one part of it. So when you're talking about train stations or any sort of public transit stops on your campus, to the extent that those public transit or bus stops or train stations are either immediately within or immediately adjacent to your on-campus property, you would consider that location public property up until the point that that a fare is exchanged for folks to access that particular train station or bus stop. So you would consider them public property if they immediately abut your on-campus property. Abby, are there any other questions that you wanted to address for the geography part, or anything else that you would like to add to geography before we transition to Clery crime?
Sure. So we have a couple more that are coming in the question answer section, but we want to also make sure to get to the questions that were submitted for the purposes of this webinar as well. So for those of you who are plugging in some of those questions into the private Q&A, please know we will revisit as we get towards the end of the webinar and we're talking more about Clery geography there. I don't want to shut down any conversation. There is one in relation to some of the things we're about to cover, so I'll raise that here and then we'll move into the Clery crimes overview. But anything else, Laura, that you wanted to flag from a content perspective now before we move on to some additional content in the FAQs, and then we can raise some of the questions in the private Q&A?
No, I just wanted to see some of the answers that folks were sharing with the question that we posed about campus partners that you all work with when you are classifying Clery geography. And many of those are ones we would suggest, so either local police or your public safety or police on campus. Some folks are saying that they also work with their Clery coordinator or their safety and security committee. One quick question that is being asked is, are geography maps required? So Clery geography maps. They are not a requirement under the Clery Act, but they are certainly a promising practice, as you'll see when we transition into this next section on Clery crime. It's most helpful to know your geography ahead of time, so that way when a crime occurs, you know immediately whether or not you would even worry about classifying it in your statistics, because you would know if it took place within Clery Geography. So we at Clery Center do recommend putting together a Clery Geography map, but it is not a requirement of the Clery Act. But other than that, Abby, I think it's great to transition to Clery crime.
Okay, great. And for those of you who are asking questions right now related to using hotels as student housing and that definition of directly supports in relation to educational activities and some info on the daily crime log, we are going to address some of those things as we move on to some of the FAQs. So please know that we are not missing your question. We will revisit them as we get further in the webinar. The one thing I do want to address here in relation to the questions, just to reinforce and expand on some of what Laura was talking about, for our 3 years of crime statistics required, are they separate from the annual security report? I think that raises, one, we're about to just do a quick overview of Clery crimes, but I think that that raises a question or a common area of confusion for a lot of institutions. So you are going to share information about your crime statistics in 2 separate spaces, but the information should be the same. One space in which you share crime statistics for the previous 3 calendar years is in your annual security report. So Laura at the start of the webinar talked about how institutions put together this annual security report that has both crime statistics and policy statements summarizing specific policies that exist on campus. So that's one place in which you have to share crime statistics specific to what you see on the screen here, and I'll walk through those just so that we have a chance to talk that through more in depth. The other place that you share those statistics is you submit them to the Department of Education. So Laura mentioned earlier WestStat, the federal contractor for the Department of Ed. They facilitate an online reporting tool that your institution uses to then submit the statistics for the previous 3 calendar years. So that information that you're sharing with WestStat should align with the information that you're reporting in your annual security report that has to be released on or before October 1st. Now, sometimes institutions will get a little bit confused by the fact that deadlines are different for the ASR versus submitting your statistics. The ASR deadline is October 1st, whereas normally, unfortunately I haven't seen the timeline yet for this year, but it's normally around October 15th, sometimes a little bit before, sometimes a little bit after. Sometimes it depends on whether there's a government shutdown, so a few years ago you got a week or 2 extra amount of time. But please remember that both of those are separate obligations, but that should reflect the same statistics. So your institution, I know that many campuses have mentioned that they've already gotten that form from WestStat to submit their statistics, so they can start working and compiling that information and submit it as soon as it's ready and available. You normally get that, the institution normally gets that information right around August. And they plugged, a colleague plugged in October 17th as the date for this year, so thank you so much for that, is when that data collection closes for the online reporting tool. And then that information that's shared in the online reporting tool is then shared in an online cutting tool by the Department of Education, so parents and students can actually access that information and search for specific campuses and what those statistics look like. So one of the reasons why the Clery Act does have specific definitions that all institutions are required to use when reporting their statistics is so that there can be some consistency if I am a member of the community and I look at that this institution is sharing information about burglaries that took place in their campus community, that the way that they are defining burglary is the same as all other institutions regardless of what state they're in. So state laws can differ, but from a Clery perspective, institutions have to put on a Clery hat, so to speak, and make sure that they're classifying crimes using the Clery definitions, and those statistics are what's reported in the ASR and shared with the Department of Education. So before we go into some of the FAQs, just wanted to do a quick overview of what those crimes are. Now, no, this is a little bit different, or very different, I should say, than what you're reporting in daily crime logs. For institutions that do have campus police or security departments, you maintain a daily crime log of all crimes that are reported to campus police or security. Whereas for the purpose of your statistics in the ASR and for sharing with Department of Ed in that capacity, you're reporting for specific types of crimes. So that includes the first bucket is called criminal offenses, although as we'll note, they're all criminal offenses, but that's the label the Department of Education uses for these in particular. And that includes homicide, so murder, non-negligent manslaughter, and manslaughter by negligence, sex offenses, which includes rape, fondling, incest, and statutory rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, motor vehicle theft, and arson. There's also hate crimes that are reported by the institution, so when an incident is motivated by bias in specific bias categories. And for that reporting, institutions are reporting incidents motivated by bias for any of incidents in the criminal offenses category, except for manslaughter by negligence, because you can't have a hate crime for manslaughter by negligence, as well as the additional crimes of larceny, theft, intimidation, simple assault, and destruction, damage of or vandalism of property. So if any of those types of crimes were committed as a result of bias in one of the bias categories, race, religion, gender, gender identity, ethnicity, national origin, disability, and sexual orientation, then that would be reported within the statistics, typically for most institutions in a narrative format, whereas the rest are reported in a table in the annual security report. There's also Violence Against Women Act offenses. So these were the offenses that were added in the most recent amendments to the Clery Act: dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. And then arrest and disciplinary referrals for liquor law violations, drug law violations, and weapons law violations. So those violations, there has to be an arrest or a referral in order for it to be in the statistics, and it does have to be a law violation. So different than maybe some campus policies where an individual might be able to violate a campus policy related to alcohol, so say, for example, drinking on a dry campus, but if it's not a law violation, it wouldn't be reported in those statistics. So we wanted to do that before moving into some of the FAQs. So hopefully some of what we've already talked about has given you some thoughts around what information might be useful to share more broadly with members of your community, whether they're CSAs or just individuals who might want to know more or understand more about what the institution is required to do under the Clery Act. And so now we're going to move into specific categories based on what we just described. So we're going to start with the questions specific to campus security authorities. We had a number that were submitted in advance of the webinar. From there, we'll move on to geography and some of the other categories. So as you're thinking about questions popping up for you, we'll start to explore those questions once we get to that topic area. So the first one is CSA frequently asked questions. So these are ones where not only were they shared with us, but they're things that we hear quite frequently when working with institutions offering training. And the first is specific to one type of role. So it says, what if a student comes to me, a counselor, and tells me about an assault that happened to him or her on campus, but doesn't want it reported to police because it's the person's partner? As a counselor, we have to protect a student's right to privacy. How do we handle this when we also work for the college? So there are a couple of different layers you'll want to consider when answering this question for your institution. The first thing that I'll note that we mentioned a little bit earlier is that pastoral and professional counselors are exempt from CSA reporting. So if this person, they're labeled a counselor, but we would want to understand if at the context of the institution, they meet the definition of a counselor as defined by Clery Act. But say that is the case, that person is exempt from reporting. But I think there are a couple of things that the institution will want to think about when we look at messaging and the broader picture. So one of those things is when we do have confidential resources like our pastoral and professional counselors, do the individuals within our campus community who are going and sharing their stories, sharing their experiences with them, do they have an understanding of what that confidentiality means and the limitations then on potential limitations on institutional response based on that confidentiality? We've seen a number of scenarios where a student would come forward, share information with a counselor, and then feel as though the institution didn't do anything to support them because they thought that report to a counselor would result in a number of other campus actions. They didn't recognize that confidentiality truly means that information isn't going anywhere. That said, you want to think about, well, what is the role of our counselors in making sure that individuals have the information that they need? So one thing to consider is that campuses have to put together a written explanation of rights and options that needs to be afforded when someone comes forward and makes a report to the campus. So think about whether your counselors have that information readily available so that when they're working with a client that they have confidentiality and they can't share the information, that individual is still receiving information about reporting options outside of just that confidential resource. Your institution is required to communicate about that actually in your annual security report. So you have to, as a campus, talk about your policies for voluntary confidential reporting. So do you have any systems where an individual might report confidentially to the campus community? So say, for example, that is a structure where an individual can report to law enforcement but not have them pursue a criminal complaint. So there's some sort of confidential option. Other institutions, this looks more like an anonymous reporting option. But in general, institutions have to talk about, do we have a policy for voluntary confidential reporting that when information goes to that place, the campus, although the person may not want to pursue a disciplinary process, for example, the campus will still have the information to consider for their crime statistics. They would still do the analysis for the timely warning, for example. Then the second part of that requirement is once we've communicated, do we have a voluntary confidential reporting option, institutions then have to disclose whether or not they have a policy or procedure in place that encourages counselors to inform the individuals that they're counseling of that confidential reporting option. So there are a number of different places where your policies have to speak to what information do counselors then communicate when they're receiving this context. They may not be a campus security authority. They may be limited in what they're able to share, but that doesn't mean that we don't want them to be prepared to connect that individual to other resources if that's something that they would like to see happen. So I think that covers kind of all of the different pieces. It's really helpful to consider in relation to that role of the counselor. You also certainly want to be conscious of the fact that there may be exceptions to that individual's role when there's an immediate threat to the health or safety of that individual or other members of the community, or even that counselor who has confidentiality might be legally required to share information more broadly. And for that, you'd want to really look at the scope of the role of the counselor and what those legal requirements are within the state. Laura, is there anything else that you would highlight or reference for that particular question before we move on to some of the other ones?
No, I think you've covered it all.
Great. So the next one we have here is, do CSAs have to report things overheard or learned indirectly? Do papers written for class assignments count in this area? How does that intersect with faculty who are considered responsible employees? And that's a really, really great question that comes up quite a bit, because one of the distinctions for most campuses between CSAs and responsible employees is the Department of Education has said that faculty isn't typically deemed to be a campus faculty members aren't typically considered to be campus security authorities under the Act. So the first thing you'd want to consider is you may have some faculty members that are still CSAs because they play another role in addition to being faculty that gives them significant responsibility for student and campus activities, especially where we see this a lot is when they're an advisor to a student group, for example. So you may have some faculty that's wearing multiple hats, and as a result of that, they are CSAs. But let's kind of go back to the core question of CSAs, and then we'll move on kind of a little bit more deeper into the faculty piece. So first, do CSAs have to report things that are overheard or learned indirectly? The Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting does address this specifically, and it does communicate some boundaries in when CSAs have to share information, in that if it's something that's overheard, so say you happen to be in a bathroom stall next to someone who shares a story on their cell phone about an incident, or learned indirectly in some way where the individual was not seeking that person out to communicate the information to them, typically those types of disclosures would not be reportable under Clery. So there does have to be some element of the person coming directly to the CSA to share the story. Now, I think it's important to consider that, one, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're coming to that person because they recognize, I'm coming to you in your CSA hat and I'm looking for X to happen. So you could still have a scenario in which someone is talking to a CSA not recognizing they're a CSA, and that CSA would still be required to pass the information along because the person told them or sought them out directly to share this information. It also doesn't necessarily mean that that person has to be the victim themselves. So it could be someone who learned information about a friend, is trying to figure out how to help a friend, but that CSA is still receiving that direct disclosure. Whereas if it's something like information shared during Take Back the Night or in a prevention program, that type of thing, those are, in the way that it's described in the handbook, those are not considered to be CSA reports. Now, that said, sometimes those things may result in CSA reports where someone, there might be a triggering experience they have in one of those locations, and now they're seeking out a CSA to share the story. So that's not to say that there can't eventually be a connection between them participating in that activity and then eventually sharing. But things generally overheard or learned during something like a Take Back the Night would not be considered to be clearly reportable. Do papers written for class assignments count in this area is an interesting question, because it's although the handbook speaks directly to some of the things that I just discussed, it doesn't speak directly to, and Laura, share if you have anything to add here, it doesn't speak directly to what's shared in papers. And I think institutions' practices tend to vary from campus to campus as to how they would apply those types of disclosures or how they consider those disclosures. For example, most institutions do consider faculty to be responsible employees, so that could be one avenue in which faculty is learning information as part of a class or as part of that educational opportunity. Some institutions have written into their policies that information shared in a paper or a program, kind of going back to some of the language from earlier, is not considered to be a report. However, anything disclosed directly to an individual is considered to be a report. So it's factors that you'll want to consider. What does your actual policy say about what's considered to be a report or a disclosure? And to make sure that you're very clear with your campus security authorities and your responsible employees that that individual that's seeking them out doesn't necessarily have to have identified them as a CSA or a responsible employee in order for the institution to still be, or the individual to still be required to pass the information along if they're seeking out that CSA or responsible employee directly to share information about a crime that occurred. Laura, is there anything you would add to that or disagree with?
No, I think you covered it all. It's just the interesting point that you already mentioned is how nothing is very clear on anything that's provided in writing. So I would agree with you, as campuses probably approach that differently, and then certainly taking into consideration whether or not faculty are responsible employees would influence how you would address that kind of situation.
So the next one we have is, what are some factors to consider in determining whether or not student leader positions like orientation leaders, diversity center leadership positions, et cetera, fall under officials with significant responsibility category, especially if individuals are not directed to report crimes to those roles? So I think that's a really good question, and one, I just appreciate that this question assumes that the individual is making this analysis for things like orientation leaders, diversity center leadership positions, et cetera, because sometimes those could be the type of roles that are easily overlooked. And I would really go back to what is that definition of official with significant responsibility for student and campus activity. So the way that the law defines official is an individual with the authority or duty to act or respond to issues on behalf of the institution. So some questions that I would consider in relation to that would be, one, is part of their role to develop relationships with students, and what is the expectation when information comes up in terms of what that person is expected to do. Because when you think about these roles, there might be a number of things that aren't even necessarily crimes, but that individual would be charged with passing the information along because they're not the best person to be able to respond, but they are the conduit at the institution for getting them connected to the information and resources that they need to. So through that lens, they're responding on behalf of the institution in passing the information along and making whatever ties they need to. So I would first look at what is their role, is an aspect of their role to be developing these relationships with students. Another area you could consider is whether or not they have a volunteer or job function outside of the classroom. So in this one, we're talking more about student leaders, but I think it raises the question about officials with significant responsibility for student and campus activities in general. So what I would look at is what is the frequency of interaction? What would the expectation be if serious information is being shared with them? I would say for a lot of these roles, like orientation leaders, diversity center leadership positions, you probably have some sort of protocol where if information is being shared that you feel or the institution feels is kind of beyond the charge of what this individual is able to respond to, they would have to run it up the chain in some capacity anyway. So I would say most campuses fall more on considering that person to be an official because they're giving some sort of response on behalf of the institution and making a connection so that there can be a broader institutional response from other individuals or roles. So that's where I would start in looking with that. I would encourage you all, if you have your own answer to that, so factors that you specifically look for when you're making that evaluation, that's a great way to use the group discussion board to share some thoughts with your colleagues. And I'll also open the door if Laura, if you would add anything in particular in relation to those roles, especially based on your campus experience working with students.
Yeah, I wouldn't add much more than you already did, Abby. I think it really just comes down to considering the function of those roles and how you would apply decision-making for making that analysis to other similar type roles, because ultimately you want to make sure that you're applying decision-making consistently across similar functional areas. I think it's also an interesting question to be raised at a time where a major pushback point for Clery is that with acknowledging certain roles being CSAs, like victims advocates or the directors of a counseling or health center, when they're acting in an administrative capacity, Clery Act has limited the amount of confidential resources for individuals to access. So many student leader positions might have come into play all of a sudden in a more reporting authority type role because students might be seeking out people that are not RAs because they know that RAs are obligated to share information on. And so now it might be a renewed assessment of whether or not roles like an orientation counselor or somebody working in a women's center or a diversity center or an LGBTQ center would now be considered a CSA, whereas they might not have functionally been something that even would have been considered to be a CSA in the past. So I think it is taking into account what the true function of roles are, how you define and classify those roles or document the function of roles, and then how analyzing if those roles fit CSA pieces it all comes into play.
And I think this last question that we have here really ties into some of the broader themes that have been coming up for CSAs in particular, and when we think about the what's your message concept for this year's National Campus Safety Awareness Month, because a lot of these questions really stem in not only who's required to report, but what is the perception about that person's role and whether or not they are expected to report, going back to what Laura just talked about. So for the last one, it was with so many reporting options, how do we avoid confusion of roles, situations of re-victimization or duplication? So I think what we're talking about there comes under a number of different issues. One is what is the student or employee expectation as to who they're sharing the information with and what the reporting obligations are of that individual. And then the other piece of that is then when that individual is carrying out their responsibilities, how do they share enough information to make sure that we have a sense of whether or not what's being reported here has been reported in another location. So I'll answer or address the first piece. If we're thinking through the lens of what's your message, I had a really great conversation actually with a campus about this just this morning because we were talking through the concept of we have the advantage is we have a lot of resources. The disadvantage is does that amount of resources become really overwhelming or confusing? So I think the starting point about in order to avoid confusion of roles or situations of re-victimization or confusion about that would be to really think about what are the places spaces in which we're communicating what these roles are and what the expectations are of the people who do report. So, for example, do you have resources communicating to your campus community what CSAs are, what responsible employees are, what happens when someone makes a report to a CSA or responsible employee? Do your CSAs and responsible employees feel comfortable communicating about themselves? Have you done any skill building and training or otherwise to prepare them for having that conversation? Because when we think about situations of re-victimization, for example, so often where that theme comes up are scenarios in which someone went to someone expecting one outcome and something very different happened. And so preparing CSAs to actively communicate about here's my role, here's what you can expect as a part of that, here's what other resources are available, and then really also drilling back to what written information are we providing that helps to make this clear is very useful. And then the last piece in relation to duplication would really look at, well, what are our systems for collecting these reports or sharing this information? Do we have things built in to try to avoid that challenge? So one that sounds very basic but that has been helpful for a lot of campuses is, do you have something on your CSA reporting form where the person can indicate whether or not this report has been reported to someone else? So are they even asking that question? Are they communicating if the person said to them, well, I actually told my counselor this, or I told, XYZ about this before sharing it with you? That gives them a space to communicate that so that when you're cross-referencing multiple reports, you might be able to say, okay, the information for this report was exactly the same as this one, and it says here that it was reported to someone, to, this person on campus, so this is likely a duplicate report. Again, if this is something that comes up on your campus or you have your own suggestions for the best way to solve that problem, I'd also encourage you to share that in the group discussion. But to be conscious of time, I'm going to hand it back over to Laura, who's going to start addressing some of the Clery Geography FAQs, and then we can bring in some of the FAQs that you were raising in the Q&A box.
Great, thank you so much, Abby. So yeah, just a few Clery Geography FAQs here. So the first one I'll read aloud. As a career college that leases space in strip malls and office buildings, it is challenging to have policies that comply with the regulations but are relevant to our campus. What best practices do you suggest to develop relevant policies for these types of campuses? And so, I think this is a great question, and so many institutions are facing a similar concern. While the Clery Act, there is no one way to comply with it, it certainly does speak in some capacities to more traditional residential four-year colleges and doesn't necessarily provide all the answers for institutions that might be non-traditional or that might be located in a place like a strip mall or an office building. But what I would say in terms of developing policies for these types of campuses, in terms of your campus safety policies and procedures, there might be some challenges that you face enacting some of the training or education or prevention requirements. But in terms of all the other pieces around campus safety, there isn't that much philosophically that needs to be different. I would say one of the biggest concerns you might have is you have very different geography for your campus. So you would really want to consider what you consider your core campus to be, and then once you determine that, everything else flows naturally from that core campus. So anything that's more than a mile away would be falling into your non-campus property perhaps. Your public property is evaluated as it relates directly to your on-campus property. So I would say a best practice first step would be to get really clear on what you consider your core campus to be, that on-campus property. And from there, designations of different geography would flow from that. Additionally, I think establishing a network of peer institutions would be really helpful for you to rely on, because they are the folks that would be able to inform how they have handled similar questions in the past. And the best resource for you would be campuses that are similarly structured or organized or run. So I would definitely rely on peer institutions or institutions that are set up or established similar to your own in terms of comparing notes. And in addition to that, there are some program reviews that have been conducted on campuses that are not necessarily four-year traditional campuses. So I would recommend reviewing those program reviews on the FSA Financial Student Aid website as another source of information for you in terms of understanding how the Department of Education would land on different aspects of Clery compliance as they compare to a college with maybe a more non-traditional setting. In addition, as with many community colleges even, you might have a unique situation where you depend or rely on community resources more than a traditional four-year residential college that might have a lot of those resources in-house. So a lot of your policies might be written taking into consideration that you work a lot more closely with local law enforcement or a local community violence prevention organization to enact some of the requirements. So what I would recommend is really that development of a multidisciplinary or cross-departmental team to have everybody on the same page for actions like developing your annual security report or compiling and classifying Clery statistics would be so crucial. So developing any sort of a Clery compliance team or a multidisciplinary team to draw from the different perspectives of all the different partners you're intersecting with, even if they are not employed by your institution, it sounds like they might be influencing some of the work that you need to do. So developing a team where everybody can work together and share information across perspectives would be super helpful. So that's just a couple of best practices there. Abby, would you suggest anything else for that particular question before we move on?
The only other thing that came to mind, and I feel like you hit on most of it, was even thinking about when you're coming into some of these agreements. I think what comes up for a lot of our institutions that may be similar to this is in relation to things like security. You might be navigating with security that is already available or being used at that strip mall or that location. You might feel as though there are some limitations as to what you can ask them to do or not ask them to do, even though certainly, security or campus security authorities. So if you are in a role where you are developing contracts yourself, just thinking intentionally as you're working with some of these partners or external agencies, how much can we write into our agreement as to what those expectations are or what the law requires, so that it's a lot easier, or maybe a little bit easier coming down the pike, trying to work with them and get the information that you need. So kind of front-ending that conversation we find to be incredibly helpful, although we recognize that sometimes that's possible and sometimes that's not.
Great, thanks, Abby. So the next question here is, isn't non-campus property just a confusing term for off-campus locations? And, we get this question frequently, and I know I spoke to it a little bit earlier, but can address this now too. So non-campus property does not mean off-campus property. It is really a term that is very Clery Act specific to still reference buildings or property that are owned or controlled by your institution, but might be a little bit further away from your core campus. So the guideline that's most recently been suggested is anything more than a mile from the borders of your core campus could be considered to be a part of non-campus property. This is a really important distinction to communicate to as much of your campus community as possible, because it completely influences how somebody would analyze or interpret your Clery crime statistics. If folks look at that non-campus property column and think that that means off-campus locations, then they really might think there is a lot missing or not included in that category based on their personal awareness of how much activity happens at an off-campus or private location. So the more education your campus partners or yourself can do to make sure people understand that non-campus property is not just anything that happens, quote unquote, off-campus, would really help to further a more clear understanding of what Clery Act statistics represent and do not represent. So I always like to highlight that point, because I think a lot of people are just very confused, because naturally it is a confusing term. It's not a term you hear often, and when you even hear the term non-campus, your brain goes to a place of, oh, so this must mean everything that's not part of our campus, and that's just not necessarily true. So again, just reinforcing that non-campus property is referencing buildings or property that your institution does own or control, that does directly support or relate to the educational mission of the institution and are frequently used by students, that might be more than a mile from the borders of your on-campus property. And so when you are analyzing your Clery statistics, that non-campus property column does not represent things that would happen at a private house or a bar, unless those locations for some reason have a written agreement for use of space by the institution for whatever event was taking place. And so there are some pieces where those locations would qualify as non-campus property, but that would have to be because the institution has a written agreement to use that space. Absent that, if it's just, a bunch of students going out for a night at a regular local bar, that something that happens at that location would not necessarily fall within an institution's Clery statistics. So that's really where it becomes important to make sure that you are analyzing what any part of data does not represent. So this is how you would talk through your Clery statistics represent something different than the results of a campus climate survey, perhaps. The last bullet here, can you explain why all of a sudden we need to report our educational trips to our Clery coordinator? So I believe this question came from perhaps a faculty member or administrator that runs educational trips. And so what this comes from is a recent addition to the 2016 handbook. But the language in the handbook was actually derived from guidance that had been issued from the Department of Education as far back as 2012. But the 2016 handbook was the first time that it was published in the handbook. And so what that language says is that a way to evaluate this criteria of buildings or property owned or controlled that are frequently used by students that are directly or related to or support educational pieces is taking into account when you do an educational trip, if it meets one of two specific criteria, then that trip would qualify as a non-campus property or location. So two of the ways that the criteria of frequently used by students is evaluated when it comes to these trips is if an institution is going to the same location repeatedly year after year for anything more than one overnight, or any location that is more than one overnight. So if you are going to a phase, for one overnight day, then if you are doing that repeatedly year after year, that location would qualify for being a non-campus property or location. And if you are going to any place as an educational trip for students where you are staying more than one night overnight, then that location would qualify as a non-campus property. So the reason you need to maybe report your trips to your Clery coordinator is because they are analyzing whether or not such trips would just be a field trip, so someplace you're going to for the day and not staying overnight, or how many nights you are staying overnight, because those answers to those questions would determine whether or not such a location would fit within your institution's non-campus property. Some of that is more clearly explained in some of our other webinars we've already conducted this year. One of them through our Clery Today series that talked about geography, focused on some of those pieces. So if there is an interest in gaining more information or answers on this particular question, please do not hesitate to reach out to myself or Abby so we can provide some additional clarity there. But I do know we're running a little bit short on time, so I want to make sure that we touch on the Clery crime FAQs as well. But the question just came through about what about athletic travel? So yes, an example of a type of trip that could constitute an educational trip was a trip that's connected to an athletic sports event or a game or tournament or something like that. And so this chart we hope is helpful to use as a way to analyze whether or not your trip might fall into a Clery Geography category. Again, it just tries to summarize or analyze some information that's already a part of the handbook. So pages 2-25 and 2-26 within the handbook go into further detail about explaining this analysis that should take place for these trips that occur off campus. But again, if you have any additional questions, please do not hesitate to let myself or Abby know, and we would be happy to answer those for you. And then as it comes to Clery crimes, just explaining the relationship between Clery crimes and Clery geography is pretty easy and helpful to do. So your Clery crime statistics are only representing reports of Clery crimes that were reported to a campus security authority that took place within Clery geography. So it's so important to establish your Clery geography first, so that when a crime does occur, you can immediately know whether or not you even need to worry about classifying it depending on where it took place, where it occurred. So both of these things are interwoven. I like to say the phrase or the relationship is best expressed through an equation. So Clery crime plus Clery geography equals a Clery statistic. So hopefully that helps to answer that question a little bit. Another question we've received before is, I know there were hate incidents on campus last year, but the annual security report says there were 0 on campus. Why this discrepancy? And so an incident, in order for it to be classified as a hate crime under Clery, needs to reach a pretty high threshold of demonstrating evidence that the crime itself was committed due to a bias on the part of the perpetrator. And so absent that evidence, it is difficult to classify an incident as a hate crime under the Clery Act. Additionally, there are only certain actions that are even qualifying as consideration as a hate crime under Clery. And so as Abby described earlier, those would be those original criminal offenses, in addition to simple assault, larceny, theft, intimidation, or damage, destruction, or vandalism of property. And so if there is evidence that the crime was committed, and when I say crime, I mean those crimes I just mentioned as defined under Clery, if there's evidence that that crime was committed due to a bias on the part of the perpetrator, then that would be classified as a hate crime under Clery. So absent that information, an incident might qualify as a bias-related incident at your campus, but it might not rise to the level of a hate crime, in which case it would not be counted as a hate crime statistic in your annual security report. So that might be the distinction or discrepancy you're noting. And then we've already kind of touched on the information that is included in an institution's daily crime log. So again, that's just reports of crimes that were reported to your campus police or security that occurred within your institution's patrol jurisdiction. They do not have to be Clery crimes, and they do not have to occur within Clery Geography in order for them to be included on the daily crime log. You know, we are nearing the end of our time here. It is already 1:30, but I did want to draw attention to the Clery Act Essentials resource. That is a highlighted resource this week and for this webinar. You'll find it linked in the files pod on your screen, and it is also available on our NACSAM website. But this document is 2 pages broken down in a question and answer format that addresses some of these major themes under the Clery Act and provides answers in a quick, succinct, easily digestible way so that you can use this resource when you're training others on the Clery Act on your campus, or even trying to promote understanding outside of a training and just advertise a little bit about what your role or your office might do. So we hope you find this resource valuable. We would love feedback on the resource itself, so feel free to let us know either through this discussion pod or through just a regular email. But as we near the end of our time, again, I just want to be respectful of everyone's time, so it is already past 1:30. If you do have to leave, that is completely fine. I know Abby and I might hang on here for a couple more moments just to see if there are any questions that we did not get a chance to answer that did come through. But otherwise, we really do appreciate the time that you took to be with us today, especially as this is the beginning of our National Campus Safety Awareness Month programming. Our next webinar for NACSAM is this Thursday from 12 to 1:30 p.m. again. And we'll be touching a little bit on the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act and how that impacts the Clery Act in terms of understanding pieces. Abby, did you want to touch on anything else or share anything else before we end today?
The only other thing I was going to add is that we were answering questions one-on-one for some of you that plugged into the private Q&A. So if you have any lingering questions from there, please just let us know, or if you want to expand on that further. This last slide does have an email address that will go to both Laura and I. So if you have questions that you think of after this webinar, you can go ahead and send us an email. We're happy to respond or set up a call to have further discussion, because we know that sometimes that can be limited in this type of format. And then our colleague Amy is plugging in the evaluation for today's webinar. We love to use evaluations to inform the other webinars that we do during the month, as well as throughout the year in our training in general. Please just take a few moments right here at the end of the session and just share your thoughts on what you liked, what you'd like to see more of, anything that's still lingering for you so that we can address that. But other than that, just thank you very much. We really appreciate your time, and I'll hand it back over to Laura to wrap us up.
Thanks so much, Abby, and thanks again, everyone, for sticking with us even past the 1:30 time. We do appreciate any feedback we could give through that survey, and so thank you so much again for being a part of today's webinar and for National Campus Safety Awareness Month in general. We hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Thanks so much.